So the first arm of government that we looked at was the legislature, the people who make the law. The second arm that we've got to look at are those who administer or put the law into practice or look after government, and that's called the executive. So why don't we have a look at the executive? So executive power is the power to administer the law, carry on the business of government, maintain order and security. So this is a little bit convoluted. Let's break it down. According to the Constitution, the executive power of the Commonwealth is vested in the Queen, but it's exercisable by the Governor-General. Remember, that's the Queen's representative. But the Governor-General acts on the advice of the Federal Executive Council, which is all the Commonwealth ministers. So this is actually where the power lies. Okay, with the Federal Executive Council, which are the Commonwealth ministers. So the Governor-General actually takes the advice of this group and exercises the Queen's power. So this is the group that makes the decision and implements and administers the law. So what is this Federal Executive Council? Well, what we find is that we need to come across some terms to understand what we're talking about here. So what we have are things called, say, government departments. Okay, so the Defence Department. Let's take a simple one, the Defence Department. And then we have a person in charge of that. So the person in charge of that is someone called a minister. So what we find is that each government, the party that controls the lower house, which we remember from our last slide, will decide how to organise the business of government. It's sometimes called the machinery of government, and they come up with some portfolios. Okay, so one of these portfolios will be defence, and that's of course the being in charge of our defence force. Now, some of these department portfolios vary with governments. Some of them are stable. Defence is one that's going to be quite stable. Treasury, or the people who look after all the money, is quite stable. Whereas higher education can vary. They can put some things in and out, etc. So the government decides what are the areas that it wants to concentrate on? What are the portfolios? And who is going to be the person in charge of that area? The minister in charge. Now, if it's a really important portfolio, like defence, the person in charge is called a senior minister. If it's a less important portfolio, it's a junior minister. Now, these ministers, the people in charge, can come from either House of Parliament. But you'll remember from earlier on in our principles of the Australian government that we don't have a strict separation of powers. And this is where we see the executive blends with the legislature, because the ministers, the people in charge of the areas of government of the executive, actually come from the legislature. We do this because it is the principle of responsible government in action. That when these ministers take an action or their department does something, they have to report back to Parliament, because the parliamentarians can ask them questions from the opposition, etc. So they're more responsible and accountable, and that's why we have the system that we do. So these ministers, the people in charge, don't have to come only from the House of Representatives. They can come from either house, either the Senate or the House of Representatives. But importantly, the main leader, the leader of government, the prime or most important minister, that's why we call him the Prime Minister, must come, well, by tradition, comes from the House of Representatives. Okay. The members of the political party who aren't a minister are known as backbenchers. Why? Because if you look in Parliament, they have these rows of benches, and the ministers sit at the front and the people without a ministry sit at the back. They sit on the back benches of Parliament. Okay. So there's some terminology: minister, prime minister, senior minister, junior minister, backbenchers. So the political party with the next to largest, so the second biggest number of seats in the lowest house, is called the opposition. The leader of the opposition. So it's not kind of a shadow prime minister. It's called the leader of the opposition, the alternative prime minister, the leader of the opposition, will appoint shadow ministers, okay, because they're shadowing the real minister. And so they're kind of like a spokesperson about that area or that portfolio. And that becomes a shadow cabinet. So cabinet, we really haven't looked at cabinet. Okay, so the executive council, which is all the ministers. Okay, so let's just say we have the legislature here, the House of Representatives. And what we're going to have is two groups. We're going to have the opposition and we're going to have the government, whichever party gets elected. Now, one of the things we said is that we have all these people, right? And that only a subset of them are ministers. They get in charge, and the ministers are in charge of a portfolio, an area of government. These people are called the backbenchers, yep. But even within the ministers, we have senior ministers and junior ministers. Now, these senior ministers, is a subset, and they're called cabinet. Why? Because in Great Britain, they actually used to meet in a cabinet. Okay, it was enough people to fit in a cabinet. So there's a smaller number of people. These are the senior ministers. And this cabinet exercises power on a day-to-day basis. So they're the ones who realistically are making all the key decisions and keeping up to date and across everything. You don't get to make a law or implement something without it passing cabinet, the small subset of senior ministers. And then what we have is in the opposition, might call it the shadow government, we get the same kind of structure with a shadow cabinet, okay, with shadow ministers, etc. Okay, so that's the structure of our executive. Most of the power held here. All of these people, the Federal Executive Council, are ministers who run departments, and the power is exercised by the Governor General, right, on behalf of the Queen, according to the advice of the Executive Council, which follows what Cabinet says. So that's where real power is exercised. Now, a little bit of a complicating factor when we talk about the executive is that some aspects of the executive, some elements of the executive can actually make law. But hang on, I thought that was the legislature's role. It is. But the legislature might not have the skills, or it might be too busy, or the law might need updating. So it actually delegates some areas of lawmaking down to other parties. And what comes out of that is what we call delegated legislation. So let's have a look at that. So Parliament will often pass the overarching principles and objectives of a regulatory scheme as part of its bill and legislation, but then it delegates to a branch of executive the regulations. That's really the detailed rules. It's called regulations, bylaws, etc., or just that term, delegated legislation. Who might have that power? A government department, often local governments like councils have it. In fact, unis have it, right? That's why they can fine you here at QUT if you park in the wrong spot, right? Normally you can't fine someone, businesses can't fine someone. You have to actually have lawmaking power, and the university has been delegated certain limited powers to do that. That's called delegated legislation. As we've said, different terms can be used for delegated legislation. Regulations, bylaws, local laws, orders in council, they're all delegated regulation. They do have the same effect as an Act of Parliament. However, they only have power to make a law if it's delegated by an Act of Parliament. So there's an accountability mechanism. So what you have is Parliament delegates a small area of lawmaking to this body, and so this body is accountable back up to Parliament and there back to the people. That's the democratic link. Why would we do this? Parliaments often don't have the time to vote and debate every little rule and regulation. So they debate the overarching principles and objectives and how it's going to work in principle. So then they delegate the detail because they don't have the time. It often also could be that they don't have the expertise for these complex and technical rules. So that's better down in a subsidiary body. Also, these bodies, like government departments and local authorities, usually understand the problem better than politicians, so they're in a better position to do the detail about how to make the law more applicable and more workable in the real world. So there's 3 good reasons why we'd have delegated legislation. Of course, some people will argue that it's undemocratic, like we didn't elect these people and they're making the law. So we should really not allow them to do too much. That is a genuine criticism of delegated legislation. Another key criticism is the dreaded red tape. Right? You give someone the power to make law, they'll make lots of laws, so that we end up with a whole lot of these bylaws and regulations that become unwieldy and actually hard to operate in the real world. We're going to have a quick look at an area. And you might even get a chance to do this in your workshop. Look at how we have an overarching act, the Tobacco Plain Packaging Act, and then the subsidiary or the delegated legislation. And look at the difference there between the overarching principles in the act and then the detail that's in that regulation that implements what the act was actually trying to do. That's how delegated legislation works. And it would be really worth you having a look at these to see the difference and the level of detail in that regulation. So again, that's a very brief introduction to the executive, some terminology, the principles behind how it operates, and the idea behind delegated legislation, that the executive might have a legislative or lawmaking role, but really only when it's being delegated to them for some specific reasons, that they have the inside expertise and maybe the time to do that regulation properly. So the final area that we're going to look at, the final arm of government, is of course the judiciary, which is what we're going to look at next.